As a huge fan of Nintendo games, I usually enter their Nintendo Directs with low expectations. Given the way they've treated some of my beloved franchises such as Paper Mario and Mario Party, mainly Paper Mario, sometimes I come to these Directs filled with more worry than excitement. But there are times where having no expectations can pay off, especially when you have two massive reveals to start and end what was considered to be a pretty great presentation. While Breath of the Wild has been out for almost 2 years, plenty of people were curious as to what the next installment in the franchise would be and when it would be revealed. There was speculation about a Skyward Sword remake or a new 2D Zelda. I had watched this direct with the thought that even a remake of a Zelda game would be highly unlikely. You can imagine that I was caught off guard by this, especially with a game that I don't think anyone saw coming. This game, of course, being The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. While I could sit here and question why they didn't call it Link's Reawakening, we're going to discuss something different. Because this game arguably has one of the most unique art styles compared to previous titles. While I would in no way call it controversial, it has been discussed by people who lie on both sides of the fence. But I feel that this design was purposely chosen based on the original material they had to work with. Now, to make a confession, before the reveal, I had never once played the original game, and I felt that if I were to talk about why the stylistic choices work, I needed to go through the older games so I knew what I was talking about. So I did what any YouTuber would do. I bought the game on the eShop and spent the next couple days playing it. So fast forward to Friday evening. Did anything change? Well, aside from seeing the message, "Wow, this looks pretty heavy, you won't be able to lift it with just your bare hands," so many times that I'll hear it in my sleep, nothing much. I'd argue that after playing the source material that it makes the art style fit more. It's important to know that when it comes to Zelda, there have been a lot of different designs, ranging from the colorful and bright Wind Waker to the more darker Twilight Princess, and at times a mix of both. Link's Awakening definitely trumps Wind Waker as the new cutesy game with its chibi-like protagonist and colorful backgrounds. But this design choice makes more sense when you look at the game in question. Something that this title does which is unique is its crossover with another franchise. You might have heard of it. I think it's called Mario? Anyways, the original game included a ton of enemies such as Goombas, Chain Chomps, and Pokies. Even an enemy that looked like Kirby was in the game. This might seem out of place, and that's because this was never intended to be an actual game. Link's Awakening started as a side project just to test the capabilities of the system, but later on, when director Takahashi Tezuka wanted to create a handheld Zelda game, it resulted in the development and release of what was once a for-fun project. Because of the limited capabilities of the system, it was easy to blend these two franchises together. But if you haven't noticed, graphics have become a bit better ever since the 1990s. This is in no way a bad thing, as developers can make games with much more creative freedom. But over the years, both Zelda and Mario have already established their art styles. And spoilers, they aren't the same. Mario games have never stepped out of their cartoony design. If any one thing has stayed consistent throughout the games, it is the non-realistic look. Even games such as Super Mario Odyssey only go as far as to add realism through the clothes and facial hair. If I were to describe its style aside from cartoony, a lot of things have a smooth, somewhat toy-like feel. Now, Zelda has gone for the cartoon look with games such as the Wind Waker, so couldn't they just reuse that cartoony look to fit with the Mario theme? They might have, but there are a few reasons why it wouldn't work. The transition from a 3D to top-down Zelda may have looked very unappealing with the design. It might have to do with the fact that everything in the Wind Waker is cel-shaded. This is when shadows are created without much of a gradient. It makes the game look more like a comic book, or as mentioned before, a cartoon. But I think the issue with converting this to a top-down Zelda is the fact that you lose a part of that third dimension. Going with a cel-shaded game would make it harder to distinguish the depth of objects, which is something you wouldn't want in a game like this. The other reason is because, while the style is similar to Mario, it isn't the same thing. I don't think any Mario game has ever gone with a cel shading approach. Super Mario Odyssey is a great representation of the games, as the shadows are always portrayed in a gradient look. Combining these would show an obvious contrast of different styles. This is why, in my opinion, the Link's Awakening remake is basing the Zelda design off the Mario one and not the other way around. If you notice, all of the Mario enemies shown look like their models were directly ripped from actual games within the mentioned franchise. You can also see that the lighting chosen isn't the cel shading, but more fit to a Mario game. as all shadows are built upon a gradient design. Notice how vegetation, despite being a part of nature, has a glossy look as if it's plastic. This fits well with the Mario style, as those games tend to have minimal texture design. While this is all just a hypothesis, I'm sure the inclusion of Mario characters had a huge impact on the final look. But the second biggest reason this style works would have to do with the story and themes of the game. This is the part where I'm going to have to give a spoiler warning. I wouldn't normally do this, but since it's a very old game getting remade, there's a good chance that many people will be playing it for their first time. For everyone else, let's continue. When I played this game, I didn't know what to expect. I have to admit that my library of completed Zelda games is rather slim, but this game's story is arguably one of the most unique ones. As you play through the game, you get more and more hints as to what this world really is. In the end, the implications are that you were dreaming the whole time, and therefore, the island of Kolohint doesn't actually exist. I'm sure I just butchered that name, I'm so sorry. It was a world that was created when you were dreaming, and in the end disappears once you wake up the windfish. In truth, it's a bit more than implied. You have clues such as the boss keys being called nightmare keys, along with enemies that specifically use the term dream. All I can say is that this whole story has intrigued me, so stay tuned for a possible theory video. So why does this all factor into what art style the game chooses? Well, I think it has to do a lot with the fact that everything in the world is the work of fiction. And I don't mean that it's a video game so it's fake fiction, but that this version of Link is how the original perceives it in his dreams. The plasticky toy-like appearance of everything sounds like something that a child would make up in his mind. In fact, this would explain why the art style in the opening compared to the actual game is very different. Because this is the reality, and this is how Link sees the world through his imagination. I saw a comment made by someone who had a great explanation for this design choice. It's almost like this world is an abstraction of how Link perceives the world, which is why the very same Link that is the focus of A Link to the Past doesn't retain that physical appearance here. In fact, the juxtaposition of the art style of the initial cutscene on the water and the actual gameplay points to this very same idea, as the shipwreck event takes place in the real world, while the game does not. This is a genius decision when you think about it. It's a way to give hints at the story's outcome by only using the art style of the game. Speaking of art style though, what are the pros and cons for this look? I'll go ahead and start off with the bad part. While I think this look is perfect for the game, the biggest flaw comes from the design of Link. I had talked about how a character's appeal greatly depends on the facial expressions and actions they take. This is why no voice acting was necessary for older Zelda games, and the inclusion of it in Breath of the Wild may have taken away some of that appeal. I discussed this in an older video where I talk about the characters of Breath of the Wild. A link will be in the upper part of the video, as well as one to the actual video. Now, why is character appeal a problem for this remake? Simply because when you have a character whose face is compiled from a few dots and a single line, it's kinda hard to give them noticeable expressions. Yes, you can say that technically the original had no expressions, so it's staying more true to the source material, but even A Link Between Worlds did a decent job at the facial animations. There's also a small problem coming from the fact that there are times when a darker tone is set, especially for some of the bosses. But compared to other games such as Twilight Princess and Majora's Mask, it isn't as main of a focus, so I don't think the transition will be too bad. But with all that said, a positive with this art style is that the world can look more vibrant and full of energy. That's because of how colorful these lands can be, specifically due to the toyish designs. When I had played the DX version on the eShop, while it looked decent, it didn't fully capture the look that I feel the developers were aiming for. This can be said especially for the dungeons. A couple of them, such as Turtle Rock, had very distinct looks, while most others felt very similar. Of course, this issue doesn't reside with the developers themselves. It just had to do with physical limitations of current-gen hardware. I think the additional color and lighting is going to improve these areas the most and enhance the immersion. To be honest, nothing else really comes to mind for the positives. There's more, but that would be reaching deep into opinion territory. And honestly, that's what it all comes down to. you can still dislike this art style, and that's perfectly acceptable. In fact, I'll admit it. This looks straight up weird, but that shouldn't be taken in a negative way. There's one thing I have to say though. I don't want this art style to be used again. Ever. And it's not because I hate it. It's because this design choice is what makes this game unique. It is its own identity. If other Zelda games went down the same path in terms of style, it would take away the impact that this one game has, because it would no longer be special. Other games would give off the exact same vibes, which would ruin the whole point of it. I think this is the biggest reason the game looks like this. It's to create a lasting impression on the player, one that they will never forget. This game could have gone with the Link Between Worlds look, but it didn't. I just hope that this decision was the right one for this game. I have a feeling that it is. Thanks for watching today's video. I got plenty more planned specifically around this remake along with the original source material. If you want to see more, make sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.